Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's National Conference of State Legislatures webinar, How States Can Help Small Businesses Recover from the Pandemic. My name is Emily Mayer, Policy Associate of NCSL's Fiscal Affairs Program. In case you're just tuning into an NCSL event for the first time, this slide gives a short overview of what we do. NCSL is a bipartisan organization that serves the legislators and legislative staffs of the nation's 50 states, its commonwealths, and territories. NCSL provides research, testimony, and opportunities for lawmakers to exchange ideas on pressing state policy issues. For more information on NCSL's meetings, activities, and services to legislators and legislative staff, please visit our website, www.ncsl.org. Now, before we begin our webinar and introduce our speakers, I wanted to review a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is a platform for information exchange and engagement, so we encourage participation through our chat box on the lower left side of your screen. Please feel free to type your questions and respond to any questions in the chat box. And to get some practice with the chat function to also learn who's on the line today, I invite you to type in your state now. We will hold a formal Q&A for our speakers later in the agenda. Lastly, a recording of this event will be made available on NCSL's website in the next few days. Now that the housekeeping is out of the way, let's get back to why we're here, to understand how states can help small businesses during this pandemic and economic downturn. It's my pleasure to introduce our three speakers. First, we will hear from Allison Wakefield, Associate Manager in the State Fiscal Health Team at the Pew Charitable Trust. Allison is going to share some practices states can adopt when designing and evaluating incentives. Then we will hear from Ellen Harpel, founder of Smart Incentives, who will discuss the questions state policymakers and economic development officials should consider when assessing business needs and measuring incentive results. Lastly, Corianne Edwards, the Managing Director of Operations for the Utah Governor's Office of Economic Development, will provide insight on how Utah is helping small businesses recover from the pandemic. After all the presentations, we will take a few questions from the audience. Again, any questions or comments, please type it in the chat box and we'll be sure to get back to those questions or follow up with your questions following the webinar. At this point, I'll turn it over to Allison. Thanks for joining us, Allison.
Hi, Emily. Thanks so much for having me today. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. So we're here to talk about assisting small businesses, but before we dive into that subject, I'm going to take a few minutes to share some higher-level practices that apply across incentive type and economic objectives. For those of you who aren't familiar with Pew, we are a nonpartisan research and public policy nonprofit dedicated to serving the public interest. The teams at Pew help states and localities adopt evidence-based policies that are proven to work on issues ranging from retirement savings to protecting public safety and health. I am part of Pew's State Fiscal Health Team, and we help states and cities advance data-driven policies to build fiscally well-managed governments. This includes helping them improve the effectiveness and predictability of the costs of their tax incentives. And we do this by working with policymakers to design and implement processes to regularly and rigorously evaluate the fiscal and economic impacts of tax incentives. Then we also help the analysts tasked with the evaluations to produce high-quality reports with well-supported conclusions. And then finally, we work with policymakers to interpret the results of incentive evaluations and incorporate them into their programs. Evaluations have spurred in-depth policy conversations about states' and cities' economic development objectives and whether existing incentives align with those goals. They have also resulted in changes that increase transparency, effectiveness, and fiscal certainty. So it goes without saying that states today are facing challenges from every direction and will be looking for strategies to help their state rebound. If incentives play a role in that, our research points to three practices that can lead to more effective outcomes and greater predictability. First, states should design incentives in ways that reduce fiscal risk. Second, policymakers should inform decisions with findings from evaluations. And third, policymakers should plan to revisit programs used to respond to the recession for continued relevancy. A sudden, unexpected decrease in revenue is one of the most challenging budget situations that state governments can face. And in years past, some states have found themselves in a situation where the fiscal costs of incentives increased quickly and unexpectedly by tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. Experiences like Michigan's, for instance, from the Great Recession show the importance of reducing fiscal risk. The state authorized a large number of tax credits in 2010 under the Michigan Economic Growth Authority, or MEGA tax credits, as part of long-term deals with distressed automakers, and did so without protections to limit the program's cost. Unfortunately, the state relied on unrealistic estimates of the number of jobs the companies would create and the salaries they would pay. Because the companies ended up paying workers more than anticipated and hired more people, they earned more tax credits. In 2015, the state had to close a multi-million-dollar budget gap with spending cuts because of the higher than expected tax claims. But such situations are not inevitable. An annual limit, or cap, on program costs are one of the most effective tools available to avoid higher than expected costs. There are many ways to design caps, and I'm happy to speak with anyone who would like more details or to share some of our resources on them. Another option is to control the timing of credit redemptions. Generally, the longer a business has to claim a credit, the harder it will be for state officials to predict the timing of the costs to the state. New Jersey is currently facing billions of dollars of incentive commitments made in the aftermath of the Great Recession, some with a 20-year claim period. The state continues to closely monitor the costs, but is unsure when it will have to make these payments. Incentives can also be linked with company performance, either through performance-based agreements or clawbacks. Performance-based agreements only provide benefits once a company has reached agreed-upon milestones. Clawbacks, while linked with company performance, can be challenging to implement, especially during a recession when states may be apprehensive to take money away from companies that are already struggling. And then finally, as states make commitments, they should track the total value of their obligations and regularly project the costs. This will help states produce more accurate revenue forecasts and avoid making promises that could cause budget problems down the road. Tax incentive evaluations are a tool policymakers can use in many ways, and during a time of fiscal and economic uncertainty, evaluations become more valuable. How can they be used? They can help identify where to invest or redirect limited economic development dollars. They can point to changes that could increase cost effectiveness or help inform conversations about the state's overall incentive portfolio, or be a resource for how to design new programs. For example, Pennsylvania's Independent Fiscal Office reviewed the Commonwealth's Mobile Telecommunications Broadband Investment Tax Credit and found the program to be falling short of expectations. In response, the Commonwealth ended the credit and created a new broadband infrastructure grant intended to expand high-speed broadband in unserved areas. If your state has a tax incentive evaluation process in place, look to those reports for information about how your programs are performing. There may be opportunities to increase effectiveness, decrease costs, or reallocate spending. Incentives should be aligned with the state's economic development objectives, and those are likely to change over time with economic conditions. So what's relevant today may not be down the road. If states create new incentives or modifies existing ones to respond to the current economic situation, they should have a plan to reconsider those decisions. One way to ensure this happens is with sunsets or expiration dates. Sunsets are an opportunity to debate whether a program should continue and in what form. Louisiana's Enterprise Zone program is an example of one way to use sunsets. State lawmakers previously tightened program eligibility to focus more on industries that bring new economic activity to the state. This meant making some service industries like retail ineligible. Lawmakers did this after an evaluation found that a number of businesses receiving tax incentives were in retail, hospitality, and healthcare sectors that are more prone to hiring at the expense of local competitors, which then generally decreases the economic impact of an incentive. However, earlier this year, as COVID began shuttering businesses, especially those in service industries, lawmakers temporarily expanded eligibility, but included a sunset on the expansion. Since July and until the end of 2021, businesses in the retail, accommodation, and food service industries can apply for the program. Evaluations, ideally part of a recurring process, are another way for states to revisit their programs. For instance, some states expanded the qualifying zones for geographically targeted incentives following the Great Recession. In Colorado, evaluators found that the state's enterprise zone program went from covering 30% of the state to 70% by 2011. In Maine, changes made between 2009 and 2010 rendered most of the state eligible for its Pine Tree Development Zone program, when it was intended to focus on distressed areas. While the states may have had valid reasons for the expansions at the time, the changes stayed in place well beyond the recovery. Evaluations can help bring these situations to light. Finally, there are some steps states can take now to facilitate these discussions in the future. If your state already has an evaluation process, make sure any newly created programs will be included in the reviews. If your state does not have an evaluation process, CUE has many resources to help you put one in place. And finally, evaluation is much easier and more rigorous with good data. Ensure that the administering agency is collecting the data that evaluators will need to do their job. Consulting your state's designated evaluation office is a good place to start figuring this out. So just to recap, there are 3 things states can do if incentives are part of their recovery strategy. Design incentives in ways that reduce fiscal risk, inform policy decisions with evaluations, and plan to revisit programs for relevancy. CUE is happy to work with states on incentive design and evaluation. I've included my email address here, and you can also visit our website at pewtrusts.org/tax incentives for more information. Thanks very much, everyone. And now I will hand it over to Ellen Harpel of Smart Incentives.
Thank you, Allison, and thanks to NCSL for hosting this webinar and to all of you who have joined us here today. So I'll be talking about small business recovery and lessons learned from incentive programs that state leaders can consider as a design or adjust initiatives to help struggling small businesses. And you'll hear a lot of the same themes that Allison talked about as we've looked at how effective ways that states are approaching this difficult task. We have seen, I think we all know, that there is just a tremendous need out there. And we know that there have already been multiple federal, state, and local programs designed to provide assistance. But we've also continued to see gaps in who that assistance is reaching. We also know that forecasts and circumstances are continually changing, and along with that, small business needs are evolving and ongoing. So I think everyone has pretty much moved past the idea behind a lot of the early response programs that we just need to get through a short-term emergency, and we're trying to figure out now how to help our small businesses survive in a different operating environment for a sustained period of time. So this presentation stems from a guidance paper that I wrote with my colleagues at the Center for Regional Economic Competitiveness for a group called the State Economic Development Executives Network, which also receives support from Pew. And there's a Q&A on the topic that's available on the Pew website, and we'll share that link towards the end of the webinar. This presentation also draws from our own work on incentive management practices and some of our recent research into incentives specifically for entrepreneurs and to support new firm formation. Just by way of background, Smart Incentives focuses on making incentives work better for state and local governments by providing processes and solutions that we hope, make this difficult topic easier to manage, and that help make sure that incentives are being used effectively and responsibly. And I want to point out that we only work with organizations offering incentives. We do not work with entities that are seeking incentives. So what have we learned from incentives? Lesson one is to make sure that the program, whether it is a true incentive or another type of financing program, or even yet again another type of small business support, is connected to a larger economic development strategy. Incentives and financing programs always work best when they're offered as one part of an economic development portfolio and when they're harnessed with other elements of that work to help achieve agreed upon objectives. Incentives should not live in their own separate box apart from the rest of what's going on. So a critical first question is, well, what is your strategy? What outcome do you hope to achieve? What we're hearing about most right now is a desire for business continuity, so trying to help keep our businesses in business. We're hearing about job growth and increasingly job preservation, and ways to address the just glaring economic and health inequities that we've seen across and within our communities, especially during this so difficult year. The challenge will be that we will want to achieve all of these objectives, but we have to be aware that there will almost certainly be trade-offs in the near term. State and local governments, many of them anyway, are going to be squeezed financially, just like businesses. And it's going to be necessary to prioritize and use the money that is available for small business programs carefully. Now, there's not one right answer to this question. It truly depends on the needs and expectations in your state and its various communities. And I do think that we'll continue to see some of these objectives shift from a growth orientation that's driven a lot of economic development practices over the past decade to more of a preservation focus. Regardless of where you are, though, and what your strategy is and the outcomes that your state is focused on, a key point here is that these efforts are not just about completing transactions or tallying the number of loans or grants or whatever that went out. Good financing programs or incentives are always connected to that larger economic development strategy, and whether the efforts are going to be deemed effective will depend on what types of outcomes have been achieved. So we'll come back to this point later in this presentation, but thinking about how to measure and report on that outcome or those outcomes should really be baked in early in the process because it is the foundation for success. Sorry about that. One of the questions that I'm often asked, and I've been asked since early in the year, is whether traditional incentive programs could be reoriented to help the businesses most affected by the COVID downturn. Allison provided an example of a program in Louisiana that took this approach. So that can work, clearly. But for most states, the answer is it's doable, but there are real challenges to doing that. We know, for example, that this recession is different than others because there are greater effects on services businesses, especially those restaurants, retail, personal services, entertainment, and tourism enterprises. These types of businesses are so important to the community fabric in our cities and our towns, and they're probably a big part of what you love about where you live and work. But a lot of our economic development financing programs explicitly exclude these types of businesses because they are local serving. And the programs were designed instead to support export-oriented or traded sectors or maybe tech or innovation-oriented firms because there's the sense that they bring new money to a community and they often generate more jobs on an individual company basis than the smaller businesses. So the reason the programs are structured like that is because they were created in response to the greatest recession. It was a very different downturn. And so if the inclination is just to build on existing programs to meet today's needs, just be mindful that they're probably not set up well to help these types of businesses. And just adding money to them or expanding them might not be the best way to go. The affected businesses have also been the smallest businesses, especially the Main Street or mom and pop shops that most of us imagine, when we're really talking about small businesses. And they are also often the businesses that don't have strong commercial banking relationships. And we know from a ton of research that's already been done that these are more likely to be minority and women-owned businesses that have been denied or locked out of a lot of traditional sources of business capital. This also happens to be true for small businesses in a lot of rural areas of the country. It's the same dynamic. So on all counts, these are segments that still likely need assistance. And our research has shown that even the state small business assistance programs often inadvertently replicate rather than fill those gaps because their effectiveness has been measured by job creation and capital investment, which favors the bigger businesses. So not only are many of our existing incentive programs not a great fit, but even some of our small business and entrepreneurship programs might be missing the mark right now. So if the idea is to repurpose or redesign programs, think about a couple of things. Think about how eligibility guidelines can be modified to serve a different target market. Consider the rules and procedures that could be changed to encourage and facilitate participation. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. And again, focus on which small business needs most need to be addressed. Do they need right now fast access to small amounts of cash to, just to stay open? Or is the more important priority longer-term financing that will help them adapt and sustain operations in a new operating environment? After considering the answers to these questions in your particular context, then you can work with your economic development professionals and explore that economic development toolbox to determine the best way to provide that assistance in an efficient and timely manner. Another issue to consider is whether financial assistance is actually the most pressing unmet need at all. Businesses have a lot of other concerns that states and economic development partners might be really well positioned to address, such as guidance around safe operating procedures, maybe technical assistance on topics like establishing an online presence or implementing new distribution procedures, subsidizing new expenses to comply with evolving health regulations, or maybe networking and business development assistance via small business and entrepreneur support organizations. One example that we've heard about, increasingly often is helping those small businesses transition from storefront only to online transactions and either maybe shipping or contactless pickup. They might need technical assistance or subsidized services to implement these strategies because they're less likely to have that expertise in-house. Most states actually have a good model for this approach. For example, in the Manufacturing Extension Partnership, which really works on the same model. Most states also offer entrepreneur support services of various types. And my point isn't so much that, go to these organizations and they can immediately, solve the problems, but there's a foundation to build on, and that this is a really good source of economic development expertise and assistance that probably already exists in your state. And then the final issue, which I'll just mention, is broadband access. You're probably all thinking a lot about this topic already, so I won't spend much time on it except to flag it here. But inadequate broadband service in too many locations can keep business owners from implementing a lot of the strategies that might save their businesses, so it remains an important topic. So next, let's take a few minutes to talk about rules and procedures. I know it's not everyone's favorite topic. It's actually one of my favorite topics because what we've seen is that in the incentive world, how programs are managed and implemented is really often the key to success, even more than initial program design. So it's really important to think about how the program works in the real world and how it's managed. It's critical, but remains an overlooked element that, again, makes a huge difference in program success. And we've learned a lot from past small business financing programs and our own research about design and implementation steps that can improve effectiveness. So we recommend that state agencies review their eligibility rules, application procedures, review or underwriting process, and reporting requirements with an eye towards streamlining the programs and making it easier for small businesses. Our research has shown that it's these procedural details rather than, again, program design that are often the biggest roadblocks, and they're the roadblocks that hinder small business participation. States can also be thoughtful about the information that's being requested and why they're asking for it during the application phase. Now, we believe very strongly in good due diligence. This is critical to smart incentive use, but in general, simple can be better. And it was really striking, again, in our research on incentives for entrepreneurial firms, how very burdensome some of the application procedures are for tiny amounts of money when all is said and done. And it was really hard to imagine what the state agency was actually doing with any of that information except, maybe checking a box that they received it. So anyway, think about the application process and be aware that states may be inadvertently excluding a big chunk of their target market just through these application procedures and documentation that they're requesting. At Smart Incentives, we use a 4x4 framework, we call it, to break the process down into steps that can be examined for both efficiency and accountability. So we look at intake procedures, application review, and rating and approval procedures, setting the terms of the performance agreement, again, focusing on those expected outcomes, establishing compliance procedures and thinking about, how are the applicants going to document to the state that they've met the terms of the agreement, and then establishing procedures ahead of time for handling the unfortunate, occurrences of when non-compliance occurs, and then reporting on results. And I'd be happy to go into more detail on any of these items during the Q&A if you all are interested. But one point I really do want to emphasize here for this group is that program outreach, implementation, and reporting, it takes time and resources, and it's best to build that into the program at the outset instead of just adding it on to existing duties and hoping that staff somehow find a way to get it done on the side or in addition to all of their existing responsibilities. So to really consider the time and resources that need to be devoted to good program management. We mentioned at the outset that a lot of states are going to be squeezed financially, and they're going to have to design programs carefully so that they're using their allotted funds well in the service, we hope, of a clear objective. But none of us truly know what's around the corner. And from the beginning, we've heard different predictions for recovery and what comes next. So, who knows exactly what's going to happen. But what does this mean for us? Well, there's not much that we can say here to mitigate the circumstances. But from a policy and program point of view, it makes sense to try to maintain some flexibility in your approach. States don't want to get locked into a direction that ends up not meeting their needs and still ends up being costly. And as Allison was describing, it also makes sense to put some guardrails around any new initiative. So, some structures that allow for some administrative discretion so that legislative action isn't needed to make, immediate changes. Considering establishing some sunset dates, scheduling a review process to see how the program's working and creating a chance to make adaptations as you go along, and setting budgets. So I also want to just offer my personal perspective here that given all of the uncertainty, permanent changes to the tax code might not be the best way to go here, given the types of business needs and, again, the tremendous uncertainty. And I mention that only because so many of our current incentives were structured that way as a reaction to the last recession. So, again, I'll put that out there and I'm happy to discuss if you like. And then lastly, it's important to prepare now for scrutiny later. There is the accountability side, of course, but there's also a positive angle to this. And I often say the whole reason that we're engaged in economic development is because we believe these activities are beneficial for our communities and our businesses and our residents. So let's prepare to tell that story. And having a defined process with clear rules and procedures that show how they can lead, how the activity then leads to expected outcomes can help us do that. And we find that people basically just have a few essential questions. They want to know who is getting how much money and what was the result. They really just want to know that money is being spent responsibly, and this is a very reasonable thing to ask. Now, having said that, reporting and answering those questions is easier said than done. States don't always have good systems in place to answer these questions for all of their programs, certainly, especially on outcomes or results, which might happen, the outcome that you care about might be months or even years down the road. But still, drawing on our incentives work, I give kind of three bits of core advice. First is keep it simple. Focus on one or two core metrics or performance milestones based on data that is easily obtained and reported. Second is to keep it connected to the objectives. So is the objective business continuity? Then how will that be measured and at what point in time? Or if the object is job preservation, then which jobs are going to be counted over which baseline and again at which point in time? Is the objective equity? How will the characteristics and locations of the businesses assisted be provided and reported in terms of, for example, dollars distributed and volume of activity? And then the third is keep it transparent. This is beneficial for all parties, including the state and the business. It's helpful for the business and the state if the terms of the performance agreement and all the required reporting forms are provided up front, for example, so that businesses know what they will have to provide, and the state can be prepared then to receive and use the information that's requested. And then, of course, prepared to make the essential data publicly accessible. So those are the main lessons learned that I wanted to talk with you about today regarding programs for small business recovery. Again, I'm happy to continue the conversation. Please reach out, and thank you very much for your attention. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Corey Ann.
Thanks, Ellen, so much. I've learned a lot from your presentation as well as Allison's, and happy to share some of the things that Utah's doing. And we're thinking through a lot of what Ellen has presented. So relieved to see we're on the same page and hopefully down the right path. So again, good afternoon to everyone. My name is Corey Ann Edwards. I'm the Managing Director of the Governor's Office of Economic Development in the state of Utah. And I've been asked to talk a little bit about what Utah is doing to help our small businesses recover from the pandemic. Just real quickly, Utah's, just to kind of get our mission from the Governor's Office, is to enhance the state's quality of life by increasing and diversifying Utah's revenue base and improving employment opportunities. We do that through a vision of promoting a business-friendly environment, aligning industry and education to support a world-class workforce, supporting entrepreneurship and small business creation and growth, encouraging collaboration with our partners across the state, and providing sustainable incentives to attract and keep high-paying jobs in the state, as long as thinking through infrastructure and workforce development. I think as everybody has experienced here on the call, that the COVID's economic impact was sudden and severe and uneven. The Utah's economy continues to perform well during this time, so we're definitely grateful for that. And I think having a strong economy going into this pandemic has been definitely part of that. Many people, industries, and counties in our communities have been hit harder than others, and our economy continues to remain fragile because of the uncertainty that we are experiencing right now. Just a little snapshot on our employment history. So life was going pretty good. In February of 2020, we were experiencing record unemployment rates that the state had never experienced in its history, far below the national average. Our job growth rates were high. You can see our unemployment rates were 2.5 and our job growth was 2.9. So we were doing well. April definitely, March and April then definitely hit us hard as it did the world. And we experienced way up to 9.7 in unemployment rates and severe job growth rates at 7.1. Still doing well compared to the national average, but big hurts for our community as I know you all experienced as well. Doing a little bit better in October. Here are our recently published October rates, and our November rates will be coming out soon as well. 4.1 unemployment rate, and pretty much back to a stable job growth rate. Still a little decline in that. So that's kind of where Utah sits. As we said, it hit in very specific areas. As you can see here, some of our hardest hit industries throughout that, our natural resources, our leisure and hospitality, and also not on here, hard hit for food and beverage and retail. So we really looked at providing an economic response that provided a statewide impact, but also focused and designed on those hardest hit industries. So again, very specific and focused responses in many situations. As I said here, the response has been swift and large, nimble and targeted. We've been grateful for the federal stimulus money that's been provided, as well as state stimulus money that was provided. We had a large rainy day fund that we were able to leverage. Our governor and our legislators have been fabulous in how they have put this together, but it has been unprecedented in our times. Again, and then between the governor and our legislators, they have provided very targeted aid to help our Utah families and minimize the economic damage. in addition, one of the things that we've really worked at, and I'll talk about also, is really taking this, I guess, opportunity, right, for those workers that were unfortunately displaced or furloughed to help really provide them with a path to being retrained to adjust to new economic circumstances that we're in and we believe we'll be in the future. A little bit of the how GOED was asked to manage over $170 million of the COVID-19 CARES Act money, and just want to talk a little bit about some of the programs that we executed with that money. The first one was a Mask for Every Utahn. A Mask for Every Utahn was a public-private partnership to provide free face masks to Utahns who didn't have one. The state contracted with our Utah manufacturers and purchased 2.3 million face masks to help protect the health of Utahns. This state order for masks helped to save more than 300 jobs by keeping Utah manufacturers open really early on, especially in the pandemic. The next one was a loan program where GOED distributed nearly $12 million through a Utah Leads Together Small Business Bridge Loan program, and that was in March and April. This loan was the first of its kind in the Intermountain region. The first public health restrictions were established on March 20th, 2020, and the first round of the bridge loan was opened on March 31st. The loan was structured as a payback at 0% interest with the first payment due 12 months after loan acceptance. The loans range from $5,000 to $25,000. Our goal was 25% of the loans to go to our rural communities, and we actually exceeded that goal, went to approximately 1,200 businesses. That was really our first response to that. We also created an education and campaign, or outreach and education campaign strategy called In Utah. The In Utah campaign casts a wide net across the state to support healthy choices and economic reactivation. During the pandemic, the campaign's purpose is to educate and inform Utahns on the opportunity and benefits of supporting Utah businesses. It encourages us to shop, dine, stay, work, film, and play in Utah. This initiative also includes Healthy in Utah, which is a public information campaign to encourage healthy activity during the pandemic, such as following current CDC guidelines, state and local health guidelines, and not foregoing other preventative or urgent care, such as getting your flu shot and going to the doctor when you need to. We also provided hospital grants to support hospital losses primarily associated with the executive orders early on restricting elective procedures and additional costs that those hospitals incurred in supporting community needs associated with the pandemic. The other CARES Act and programs that we put together was our commercial rental assistance program, known as ComRent. This program provides rental relief to Utah small businesses that have lost revenue due to the measures taken during the pandemic to minimize the public's exposure to COVID. The program provided up to $5,000 per month, up to 3 months per location of rental assistance. It also ended up adding mortgage assistance to that to communities that own their buildings that were operating 100% of their businesses out of. So that was that program. Our educational program that I talked about earlier on was our Displaced Worker Grant program, Learn and Work in Utah. This program provides training for workers displaced due to the pandemic. As our state begins the process of economic recovery, education will serve as a pivotal role in helping individuals reskill and re-enter the workforce. Learn and Work in Utah helps our already exemplary workforce fine-tune their skills, both physically and virtual, to excel in the workplace. This was a partnership with the Utah Governor's Office of Economic Development, our office GOED, and the Utah System of Higher Education, and it provides tuition assistance for short-term education to Utah residents whose employment had been affected by COVID. Our most popular, I think, program was our Impacted Business program, Shop in Utah. This was about a $65 million program, $64 million and change, that help support businesses and provide discounts to their consumers. To qualify for this grant, businesses needed to offer a discount that had an estimated value of at least 50% of their grant amount. So a lot of businesses did buy one, get one free offers, gift cards, discounts on a service or discounts off a retail price, discounting a product that's sold till it's gone. This was really exciting because a lot of our businesses said that it attracted new customers for them, kind of reinvigorated spending in our community and helped them stay afloat during this difficult time. And then the other couple that I'll talk about real quickly is our Safe in Utah. It was to help support PPE purchases to improve workplace safety for workers and customers during the pandemic. They could buy PPE equipment, it could be used for workplace redesign, signage, technology solutions that allowed for social distancing, et cetera. And then our oil, gas, and mining, this was one of our hardest hit communities, as probably many others across the country, provided $5 million to help our energy business. These qualifying businesses had to showcase a loss during the pandemic to be eligible to participate in this program. That primarily went to a lot of our rural communities, so very helpful there in keeping those companies afloat and those jobs during this time. And then finally, we had a significant amount go to our tourism program, which was by far our hardest hit industry in the state of Utah, but though that program went to respond to the health emergencies and regional marketing to increase tourism throughout the state to help the communities be safe in how they do that. We had to work with the national parks to provide transportation solution and different needs of the visitor's experience. And then the Meet in Utah was to help our convention districts to survive as all of our live events and conventions were hit so hard during that. So that's kind of a snapshot of where our programs went. We also have a small business quarantine grant where if you have employees that have to be quarantined and you can't afford to pay them during that time, there was funding to help keep them on the payroll while they were going through their quarantine processes. All that money went to about 5,600 small businesses across the state. About 30% of those funds went to our rural communities. Just the churn in getting all that grants out, we managed a 12,000% increase in our grant applications compared to 2019. And then our In Utah campaign has reached over 357 million impressions from the media perspective. My last couple slides about kind of what's working. Really, I think what we've found through this pandemic and what we've been doing to support our community, our small businesses, and our Utahns is really strong public-private collaboration. We've seen unprecedented legislative and executive branch cooperation, which has been wonderful. We've really worked hard to find some targeted state programs, both with state stimulus money and federal stimulus money. And we have a unified command that is an interagency operation that has just been stellar through this. We have two focuses on the unified command, the health side of it and the economic side of it, and they work together because you really can't have one without the other, working together to make the recommendations for how we proceed through this pandemic and into the future. Some of the things that we're pivoting on now as part of the Unified Command is really our next steps. We're looking at short-term funding. If there is another stimulus round, what does that look like? We're looking at additional grants that are industry-specific, looking at solutions to help our businesses pivot into their new customer sets. Access to testing for our small businesses has been a huge request. and then, some of the support for additional federal programming, such as the PPP, the Payroll Protection Program, and some of those. Long-term, a lot of what Ellen kind of recommended in her presentations, a lot of business resource training are what our businesses are asking for. They're having to deal with teleworking and remote employees, how to do that, looking for peer groups and mentors. As already talked about, the online product technical training, how to do the e-commerce, how to put your business online as much as you can, the broadband and infrastructure development, which has already been talked about, support to our small businesses for international marketing, and many others that have been talked about. So we're putting together plans right now to really address that as we go into the new calendar year and how we're going to support that. So I just appreciate the time to present to you, and sure grateful for our legislators in the state of Utah and all the great work that they've done to give us guidance through this pandemic, and to our governor and to the teamwork that they have provided to really help keep our small businesses afloat. We're doing well. We're hurting like everybody else, but we're doing okay. So thanks again. And I think, Emily, I'm turning it back over to you.
Yep. Thanks so much, Corianne, and thank you, Allison and Ellen, for those presentations. Certainly a lot of pertinent information to absorb. We now have some time for questions from the audience. If anyone has one, please submit it into the chat box. And as a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be archived on the NCSL website. So to kick off the Q&A, I wanted to loop back around to Ellen's presentation. Ellen, could you talk a little bit more about the 4x4 framework that you were detailing, and specifically how states can adjust to compliance or performance as businesses are trying to adjust to just this pandemic world in general? There's a lot of things, especially for those smaller business and those local businesses to think about.
Sure. We'll start with the 4x4 framework. And so that's something that we use to organize our thinking about incentives processes. So it involves data analysis, transparency, and accountability at all 4 stages of the incentives process. So data analysis, transparency, and accountability when we're talking about the recipient. Especially for the bigger incentives, there is a fairly extensive due diligence and background process. For smaller businesses, that's part of the process that we talked about that might need to be rethought to be more appropriate for the size and scale of both the business and the assistance being offered. The second one, part of that is then looking at the deal or in the transaction in this case. So thinking about what, again, the objective is and how the transactions support an economic development strategy, and then thinking through both the fiscal and economic impact. I think one of the most interesting sets of conversations that we've had with economic developers are around that economic impact for small businesses, because the way a lot of their ROI calculations work, they do not favor local serving businesses. And so to the extent they're using these models to determine how to distribute money, they run into this conundrum. And so, we often advocate, using the model as one element of your decision-making process, but not relying on a modeled single number to make all your decisions, but understanding how any transaction or program again, supports your overall strategy, is consistent with the mission of your organization, and is connected to the outcomes that you're trying to achieve. Because a lot of times, these programs aren't meant to generate a bunch of money for the state, but that's how a lot of the ROI models are set up to function. And so just thinking carefully about the nature of the transactions and the program and the incentive when you're looking at we call it the deal in our 4x4 framework. And then after the fact, looking at compliance. And I just don't think we can overstate how important compliance is going to be, even for the small business programs. I think many of us have probably seen a lot of the reporting on the PPP program at the national level, and a lot of critical commentary about that. I think the full story is yet to be told about that, but the point is to prepare now because that kind of reporting might not happen exactly in that way at the state level, but some sort of accounting is probably going to occur. And we want to know how effective our programs worked. Did they reach the businesses that we intended them to? And if not, why not? And so we know how to do better next time. And then that leads us into effectiveness. So it's not just whether the individual businesses met the criteria and met the milestones that we hoped that they'd achieve, but overall, how well did the program function? So that's a quick snapshot of the 4x4 framework. And again, when we're thinking about small businesses, it's a little bit different than we might be thinking of, than we might have thought about our traditional business incentives. Exactly what we care about when we're looking at the recipient, the transaction, the compliance process, and how we measure effectiveness. Emily, I hope that answered your question, and I'd be happy to try to follow on if needed.
Thank you so much, Ellen. That was excellent. We do have a couple questions from the audience. And Ellen, this may be another question for you, if not Allison. Are there any states looking at converting tax incentives into grant programs as a way of delivering cash to businesses more quickly in this crisis? Ellen or Allison, do you have any idea for that question?
Ellen, why don't you take this one? It's not something that we've yet really come across, but would be curious to hear your thoughts.
I'm trying to think of some good examples. When I think of the flagship incentive programs, I don't think we've seen that process, but something that we have seen, and I'm not going to say which state because I don't want to get it wrong, but at least one state has looked at allowing small businesses to keep sales tax revenue instead of turning it over to the state. So in that way, that is a tax incentive that has become a grant. It's not a tax incentive that became a grant. It is a tax, using the tax code to kind of create a grant. So that's one immediate example. And I see the question in the chat box, and if I can think of any other additional programs, I'll follow up in the chat and share that example with the group.
And this is Corianne. I can kind of weigh in there too from the Utah perspective with our tax credit programs. We're actually looking at 2020 offering a mulligan year is kind of how we're categorizing that and allowing them to basically waive this year in their tax certification processes.
Thanks, Corianne. No, that's actually pretty interesting. I think that we have seen a few states kind of toy around with that idea as well. And Corianne, there's another question in here that might be directed towards you. So have states figured out innovative ways to support child care businesses? Did they also qualify for the Utah program that required discounts? And I believe that Chuck in the audience chat box is referring to the Impacted Businesses Grant Program.
Right. Actually, we had child care businesses a lot early on where they were, immediately impacted, get a lot of the loan programs. So we had a lot of child care companies qualify during the loan programs. They also qualified for our PPE support grants where they could buy equipment and help them to establish a safe social distance environment, as well as, yes, opportunities to participate in the Impacted Business or SHOP in Utah program. So, and the rental program. So actually our child care businesses were able to pretty much participate in all of our COVID grant or loan programs that we offered, as well as our Department of Workforce Services agency had some special money and solutions and support for them as well. So really we did try to wrap our arms around those hurting businesses.
Great, thanks, Corianne. And just a quick, go ahead, Ellen.
Well, I was just going to mention, I just learned about this the other day myself, but I understand that Colorado just this month has approved $45 million in grant funding, is what I have in my notes, specifically for child care providers. That was part of its special session set of tax breaks and assistance programs. I think that passed, but I'm not 100% sure. But that's one major program that I've seen that specifically targeted child care businesses that I wanted to mention.
Thanks, Ellen. Yeah, we've seen the coronavirus relief funds being targeted to childcare businesses as well. And of course, that deadline is coming up here in a bit to spend those dollars. But that's another avenue that states are using. And Corianne, just a quick follow-up. A lot of the marketing for these programs is really interesting in Utah. The Learn and Work in Utah, Shop in Utah, they're all pretty interesting. What sort of priority did you all give to the marketing and advertising to getting the word out to these programs and the technical assistance involved in these programs, as Ellen kind of alluded to earlier, that those businesses need?
Right. So our In Utah campaign, which was $4 million provided to us through the legislature and approved through the governor to really support and try to encourage that shop in Utah, dine in Utah, and just churn your money, right, as Utahns in Utah. And so we did a competitive RFP with an advertising agency they put forward that campaign that we selected and loved. We've done, just all the social media, billboards all up and down the state talk about it. We've done some swag material, all of our news outlets and our media outlets have all embraced it and done giveaways around it. So we just really were excited that it really it was a creative campaign and really took off. And then it converted to the Healthy in Utah to do all your social distancing really at that time to encourage people to wear masks, and then also keep going to the doctor when you need to, keep filling your prescriptions that you need, get your flu shots, all of that. So it's been a fun campaign and a lot of fun swag to go with it.
Yeah, it caught my eye early on, so it's really great. And then there's one more question for Ellen in the chat box. And Ellen, if you could quickly follow up with this question. If not, we can follow up with Kim later on. It's Ellen mentioned caution in making changes to the tax code during this time. In her research, are there certain incentives or initiatives in this area that would be beneficial to visit?
So I think the question is whether if you are going to go down the tax code road, if there are better or worse approaches to it. And I think Allison actually mentioned one that is a good approach, which is changing the rules but having a time frame set around it so it doesn't go on and on forever and maybe no longer serving its purpose. And so I think that's a good example. If you are going to do that, just make sure that it's not a 15-year tax credit, because it's just not appropriate, I think, given the uncertainty and the needs of the businesses. So that's my thoughts on that particular topic.
Great, thanks, Ellen. Yeah, absolutely. We're in, the phrase of the year or word of the year is unprecedented times. So creating those targeted and nimble programs is important. So at this time, we're going to wrap up the webinar, and I want to extend a final thank you to our presenters. We greatly appreciate the expertise each of you were able to provide and for your continued support on state policy issues and small business support during these times. And a big thank you to our attendees for participating in today's webinar and for providing questions. The recording and the presentation slides will be available on NCSL's website within a week. And lastly, we do have a few resources I just wanted to point out. The Pew Charitable Trust released a resource featuring Ellen's work on this topic area by the same name of the webinar. And you can check that out on the link provided, and I'll drop it into the chat box as well. And then, as I mentioned, NCSL is tracking coronavirus relief funds, state actions on those funds, and you can check out those actions in our database. And again, that brings us to the end of this webinar. If you have any questions following this event, please feel free to contact me at NCSL or any other of my colleagues. Thanks, and have a great day.